Another important distinction between the California Constitution is that California's Constitution is incredibly long and the US Constitution is relatively short. So depending on some third longest constitution in the world, India has number one, Louisiana is number two. It could be that we're the fourth longest if you count the British one, which is an area that I actually study. The British Constitution, never written down officially as a codified constitution, includes everything from the Magna Carta of 1215 all the way through whatever your dog soils the sidewalks in Cardiff. So it's a wide range of things that are included in the British Constitution, but that's because they never sat down and said, here are officially the system of government and how it's going to work. But in any case, depending on how you count it, California has one of the longest constitutions in the world, whereas the United States has a relatively short one. There are over 500 amendments to the California Constitution, whereas for the US Constitution, there have only been 27. We've been talking about the US Constitution for a while and saying there are only 27 amendments to the US Constitution. That hasn't changed, but there are over 500 for the California Constitution. And so you want to ask, why is there that difference? It's actually not a super exciting one, but it is an important one. It's not that surprising. It is that the California Constitution is so long because it's easy to amend, and the US Constitution is relatively short because it's very difficult to amend. And so, again, decision rules matter. The people who study politics, political scientists, actually have something to contribute to it, and that's our main contribution. There are some important political ramifications to this difference, and that is that because the California legislature can be amended, because the California Constitution can be amended, the California legislature doesn't have the supremacy that the US system does. That there are ways in which we, the people, through an initiative process, can change the California Constitution and to take away powers that the legislature has, or we can force them to deal with changes that we have made. We make a change to the budgeting rules. We make a change in terms of how much money is available for schools with Prop 13, and we basically turn around to the state and say, figure it out. And so in that sense, we have an important change, an important limitation on the power of the California government, particularly the California legislature, because there are other mechanisms whereby we can change how our system works, and that can be even amending the Constitution. We'll go through the process in a little bit, but just for now, the overall political ramifications. Special interest groups often use the constitutional amendment process in California rather than going to the legislature, rather than trying to lobby and influence legislation by the California legislature or to go to the governor to try to influence how certain laws are. Instead, special interest groups will often use the amendment process in California to put something onto the ballot and just ask the people to change the Constitution to do something that they would like, whether that might be stopping a ban on plastic bags that have been considered in different municipalities, talking about electricity rates that some have been going through, or things like that. The other ramification is that it limits the power of California judicial review. Unlike the United States, where you have an important role of constitutional interpretation done by the US Supreme Court, judicial review in California can be undermined because the Constitution that's created is not nearly as straightforward, perhaps. There might be contradictions built into it, and even the judicial branch might circling that square, squaring that circle, however you want to say it, to make it that these things that conflict with one another, how they're actually going to be implemented. Another concern is that we might have impressive rights listed on paper, but we may not have them in reality. Again, it might be because of the contradictions that are there, because of unclear wording of the constitutional amendment. But the amendment process makes it so that the California Constitution might not fit together nearly as neatly, and so we might be promised something and actually be delivered in reality. So, again, it may not be a huge observation to say, oh, the California Constitution is so long because it's easy to amend, and the US Constitution is relatively short because it's hard to amend, but it again reminds us of the role of voting rules, that those things matter quite a bit. And so moving on to some of the specifics of this is the amendment process in California. So reminding ourselves again how you amend the US Constitution. The US Constitution is amended by 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states proposing amendments to the US Constitution, and then ratification. The actual addition of those constitutional amendments requires 3/4 of the states, and only the states, in amendments to the US Constitution. Now, contrasting that is the California Constitution. There are multiple routes that can be used in order. One is there are constitutional conventions, just like the United States. There was a constitutional convention that created the U.S. Constitution. There was a constitutional century that did that. It hasn't been done since 1879 when we had the Constitutional Convention that created our current California Constitution. But some have actually floated that idea in the early 2000s when it seemed like California might have been a bit ungovernable, that there were ways in which the Constitution was restricting the government from doing what it could at the state level. It didn't actually come to fruition, and we haven't had a constitutional convention, but it is possible to do that. Another way of changing the California Constitution is to have an initiative, and that is the form of direct democracy, where the people, and if they collect a certain number of signatures, it shows up on the ballot, and then if a majority of people vote for it, then it becomes, in this case, part of the California Constitution. So initiatives can be for just legislature, just for laws, but it can also be an initiative for a constitutional amendment. And the only thing that is different if you want to do a constitutional amendment initiative is that you need to collect more signatures. It takes 5% of those voting in the last governor's election in order to put a legislative proposal as an initiative. But for a constitutional amendment, it takes 8% of those voting in the last election. That actually isn't a huge jump. It does point out that more people need to be on board with this idea. But if you have enough money, then special interest groups, wealthy individuals can afford that extra. And so they often will decide to do that because we believe, particularly because of the role that the United States Constitution plays in our ideas, that when we hear that it's a constitutional amendment that's being considered, it grabs our attention. And so in some ways, it might be easier for those proponents to get people to vote in favor of it if they say, oh, this is about changing the California Constitution. It's important enough, we need to change the California Constitution. The other route is that you could have a referendum, that the state legislature has referred this issue to whether or not we want to amend the Constitution in a particular way. More often than not, whether it's a referendum or initiative, you get many more referendums and they're more successful, but there are still a number of initiatives that came from we the people in the state of California that have become part of the. And so what we have is there are multiple routes, and the routes that are there aren't nearly as hard to achieve as in the US Constitution. So it's a combination of having multiple points at which, multiple ways in which you can amend the Constitution in California, as well as making it much easier to do, because it takes, in the case of an initiative, 8%, collecting 8% of the signatures of those voting in the last governor's election, and then just a simple majority of those voting. For a referendum, it takes 2/3 of the state legislature and then a majority of the voters. So it is a lower bar, and therefore there are more amendments. And as those amendments are added, the California Constitution gets longer. So again, taking a basic observation that the California Constitution is incredibly long, the US Constitution is relatively short, we're allowed to talk about a little bit of this kind of political science stuff in terms of the political ramifications of these things, the ways in which decision rules actually influence the outcomes that we see.